Good evening, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So, one of the questions that I get asked is, why is it that we seem to have such a resilient economy? And I found this speech coming from the Federal Reserve given just recently, October 16th, 2025. This is by Christopher Waller. Here, I got my glasses. Let me put those on. Cutting rates in the face of conflicting data. Now, very interesting statement that he had to give inside of this speech, and I'm going to bring it up here real quick and read it to you, and then we're going to talk about this for just a minute because this is very, very telling of why it is that we seem to have such a resilient economy. And now this is what he has to say. He says, another possibility is that R star, the interest rate below which monetary policy stimulates demand, is higher than most forecasters believe. If this were true, then the current setting of monetary policy may not be holding back demand and economic activity very much, which would have implications for how quickly the FOMC should lower the policy rate. Now, I think this is key to understanding the Federal Reserve and how it is that they conduct their monetary policy, because to understand that there is a restriction upon the economy, and most people just think about the Fed funds rate being elevated, but very few people have it taken into consideration where that Fed funds rate is in relation to the neutral interest rate. And now recently Jerome Powell has talked about how it is the neutral interest rate may have risen 100 basis points or be 100 basis points closer to the Fed funds rate than it was a year ago. They don't tell us exactly how far away it is, but that the neutral interest rate and the Fed funds rate are getting closer and closer together. And this is the restriction upon the economy. This restriction is becoming less and less over time. Now, we really have to take it back. Let's just slow down for just a minute and go back to the COVID era when interest rates went to zero. When the Fed funds went to zero, the neutral interest rate was also very close to zero. Now, this does not give a stimulating effect to the economy. The Fed has to be far enough below neutral to actually stimulate the economy, and if neutral is very close to zero and the Fed funds rate goes to zero, there's no stimulating effect that comes from this. This is the reason why they have to do the quantitative easing and the forward guidance. Now, COVID happened to be a very lucky event for the Federal Reserve. And when I say lucky, I mean it. The Federal Reserve had something called the make-up strategy, where they were going to allow inflation to run extra hot, extra long for an extended period of time. I'm going to leave a link down in the description to that document. Now, lucky for the Federal Reserve, COVID and the shutdown of the supply chain, the literally severing of the supply chain, caused an inflationary situation that then benefited the Federal Reserve. Why? Because it started pulling the neutral interest rate higher. If you have elevated inflation expectations, you will demand a higher return on your capital investments. You will expect to pay a higher price going into the future, and that is a self-fulfilling prophecy that will then force the neutral interest rate higher. This is the reason why Jerome Powell said that the neutral interest rate is now 100 basis points closer to the Fed funds rate than a year ago. The elevated inflation that we had experienced during COVID and the credible threat of tariffs has a continuation of this inflation expectation that continues to raise the neutral interest rate. If it raises and the Fed funds rate comes down, this economy is far less restricted, and this is exactly what Christopher Waller just said 4 days ago. Let me read it to you again. It will make a lot more sense when I say it this time. Watch. Another possibility is R star. Now, R star is a very confusing thing to look at when it comes to the Federal Reserve, but it's their judgment of the neutral interest rate. All right? Another possibility is that R star, the interest rate below which monetary policy stimulates demand, is higher than most forecasters believe. If this were true, like nobody knows, right? Because neutral interest rate isn't something that you can observe in real time. If this were true, then the current setting of monetary policy may not be holding back demand and economic activity activity very much, which would have implications for how quickly the FOMC should lower their policy rate. So when you think about it, like right now, you're watching like the Dow and the markets just absolutely killing. And everybody's saying, oh, it's about ready to pop. It's about ready to pop. And sure, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like a downturn is very inevitable at some point in time. And I'm not trying to deny that it isn't going to happen. What I am trying to say is like if you go and you look out there right now, you find that there is an economy that seems to be taking place that is incredibly resilient because the consumer seems to never give up. But as we've learned on this channel, the consumer is literally 20% of the household incomes, the top 20%. 80% of the people aren't participating in it in the same fashion. That's the scariest part here. See, this is evidence of it. This is right here, Christopher Waller pretty much admitting it, right? Now, he's trying to be vague about it, but this is what's happening because this is essentially what I have been trying to explain here on the channel for years now. And Christopher Waller says it straight up. If this were true, if the neutral interest rate has risen, right? Myron's trying to say it hasn't. All the rest of the Fed officials say that it has. So here, if we believe in the idea that the Fed funds rate and the neutral interest rate are getting closer together, then the current setting of monetary policy may not be holding back the demand. Where does the demand come from? The top 20%. It may not be holding back the demand in economic activity very much, which would have implications for how quickly the FOMC should lower their policy rate. See, this is one of the things that I look at and I think about when it comes to understanding how it is that the Federal Reserve is conducting themselves. See, they keep saying, oh man, we're focused in on the labor market. And I'm thinking that the labor market, the historically low unemployment, I mean, sure, it is weakening and then, it's moving up and it's a cause for concern. But if you go and you look at a chart of the unemployment rate, it's historically low. Inflation is above the target. If you read this entire speech, he talks about how inflation is not part of the concern and that the labor market is part of the concern. And I'm thinking, are either one of those really your concern at all? I mean, low unemployment and inflation that is just moderately above your 2% target, which isn't really a target. It's a 2% goal over time, which means that inflation can run above or below 2% any given time, so long as it averages and ends up having a long-term target of 2%. Very different thought than having a 2% target because the Federal Reserve has never, ever achieved a 2% target. Not once have they ever been able to maintain a 2% inflation, ever. There's no reason to believe that they can do it in the future. Why it is that people think that that's what they're going to do is beyond me. It's never happened before, and there's no reason to believe that it can happen in the future. So again, think about this for just a minute. You have top 20% of people who are doing the majority of the consumption. Go and Google it yourself. 10% of household incomes do 50% of the consumption. Google that. If you believe that to be true, or at least somewhat close to being accurate, then it would be safe to assume that the next 10% after that would be doing an additional 50% of the remaining consumption. That puts the top 20% doing close to 70% of the consumption or more. 30% of the people are doing, or 80% of the people are doing 30% of the consumption. And if you keep going down this line, you're going to find that the bottom 50% of the people are literally doing almost no consumption at all, comparatively to the top 20%, and really comparatively to the top 10. It's a sad state of affairs that we're in, but once you recognize and understand why it is that it's happening or what it is that's happening, and not even like maybe even the idea of why might be very difficult to even come to in itself, knowing that it's happening for a particular reason. And if you want to push it on blame, like say, oh, they're doing it as, to try and keep you in slavery. And if you want to put it into like, manipulation tactics and all that, then it's going to be very difficult to then look through history and find how it is through this timeline we have shifted from a gold-based commodity currencies to fiat currencies, going from money to banking notes essentially, and how this transfer has created not only an abundance of opportunity for people to then go and produce and make and have and sell and service and do all the wonderful things that happen out here, but it was also the exact same system that brought in ever increasing amounts of money that caused separation between the rich and the poor. It's the new money and the move into luxuries. When you see it, when you recognize it and you understand it, then it starts to make sense why it is that we have 20% of the people who seem to be kicking ass and 80% of the people going, what in the hell is going on? Why is it my paycheck doesn't make it? Why is it that this used to be a good job and now it's not a good job anymore? How come it is that the economy seems to never give up, and why is it so resilient? And who is it that it's really benefiting when you have ever increasing amounts of government action? Yeah. Once you start getting to the bottom of these things and you start looking at it in a different light, most people look at the inflation as a painful experience for them, and then think to themselves, man, they're doing this on purpose to me so that I can remain in debt, enslaved, and they can, evaporate their debts. And this is how generally a lot of people want to talk about it. They want to believe it in this fashion. And when I think to myself, yeah, they said that they were going to do it to you. They said it. Straight up, Jerome Powell said it in August of 2020. In a speech where he said that the inflation that is going to be coming, because people think it's counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation, and I think that's the most interesting part of it, is that he was calling it out before the inflation happened. August of 2020 said that it seemed counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. Here, hold on one second. I'll just bring it up for you guys. I'll leave a link to this speech down in the description so you can see it. And then I'm going to finish this off real quick with Jerome Powell's speech here from August 27th of 2020. And he had this very thing to say. And it's just like, it's probably one of the saddest things to come to the realization that they knew that they were going to do it. It says here, the persistent undershoot of inflation from our 2% long-run objective is a cause for concern, right? The undershoot is a cause for concern. I mean, how many people out there are actually concerned about an undershoot of 2%? Nobody, except the Federal Reserve. It was a major problem for them. Because, remember, they were at the lower bound of zero with no way of stimulating the economy. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. Right here, he just said it. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. After all, low and stable inflation is essential for a well-functioning economy. And we are certainly mindful that higher prices for essential items such as food, gasoline, and shelter add to the burdens faced by many families, especially those struggling with lost jobs and incomes. However, here it is. Here's the key to it. However, inflation that is persistently too low can pose serious risk to the economy. Inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in long-term inflation expectations, which in turn can pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of ever lower inflation and inflation expectations. Think about that for just a minute. August of 2020, before the inflation took place, Jerome Powell was crying his eyes out, thinking that we needed, saying it straight up out loud, we need inflation to save the day. We absolutely are desperate for it. That's what he was saying right there. I will leave a link down in the description for it. It's the PDF file, page 7 of that speech, right in the middle, that paragraph. Once you see it, once you understand it, once you recognize it, it all begins to make sense. I love how people just choose to not see this and choose instead to look at other things and then blame how it is that the economy is operating, how the Fed is buckling to the Fed or Fed is buckling to Trump and all these other accusations out there. And I'm thinking, man, I have been calling this stuff out for so long and I am not focused in on any of that other than the words that are coming directly from the Fed itself. Like, where else do you get monetary policy research from? How else can you get it anywhere else other than the Federal Reserve? These speeches are down in the description. Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know.